All right, so my name's Anthony Bloom. I'm the Executive Director of the Mobiles for Education Alliance. We'll be happy to provide more information about the Alliance later on. And my colleagues, Nicole Carney, who's in the background, Nicole, our Director of Strategic Engagement, and Scott Isbrandt, our Director of Strategic Initiatives. Sorry, Nicole, Director of Engagement, Scott, Director of Strategic Initiatives. Scott, I loved your background, which was from our recent 10th anniversary
I was
award
still in
show.
I couldn't get out of the amphitheater, apparently. It just stuck to my background.
That's perfect. But good to, and we've been doing a series of e-cafes just again as a way people that we like to hear more from and want to share their good works with others. And perfect size of the audience. Again, the idea is just to have an exchange with each other as well. And our typical format is we'll just have a conversation with Dorette and Nancy. And then invite your own, sort of raising your hands, asking of questions as well, in the course of which if ahas are planted that you want to share about your own institution's work, feel free to do that. I consider it like, I don't know how many of you have been to Rotary Club meetings. And so it's Rotarian, I'm back and Rotarian again, and it was like the lunchtime presenters. That's kind of what we thought. With the advantage of it being an e-cafe, that there's unlimited e-coffee and e-donuts, and there's no caloric worries that you have to have about the consumption of that. So I think it's a complement to the big Rotary breakfasts and lunch as well. Chris, oh, that was just giving your own sort of like hands up, excellent as well. All right, a few other folks have joined, but I'm just going to get right in, and if you don't mind, we'll ask folks to turn off your cameras, just so we don't have, except for Nancy and Dorette at this point. And it would encourage folks to please use the chat to introduce yourselves. And in the course of which we'll just use that as well to sort of ask you some questions to prompt Dorette and Nancy. Dorette and Nancy, I'll be looking at those, feeding some questions from those as well. But without further ado, let me first of all congratulate Dorette and Nancy, because we had the chance to meet through the Library of Congress Literacy Awards, where you were both honored, your institutions were both honored as best practice honorees. And I've had the good pleasure of serving on the Literacy Awards advisory panel for a number of years. So I get the privilege of seeing all these great proposals that come through, and occasionally get the chance to meet some of the best practice honorees as well. So this is a second opportunity for me to have to speak with you both. I will mention to those of you who aren't familiar, the Library of Congress Literacy Awards is actually open right now. Maybe Nicole could drop the link in, but for those that are working in this space or have groups that you'd like to encourage to apply for the Library of Congress, it's a great opportunity for visibility. Dorette and Nancy, we had a best practices event. That was a good way to showcase the works. And just reputationally, having the Library of Congress is like stamp of approval is great as well. But Dorette and Nancy, this is reprising our own sort of best practices panel we had with you and some other colleagues. So Dorette, as the director of Book Dash, I'm just going to give a little bit of background and then we'll open it up for questions. But Dorette, master's degree in education from the University of Cape Town, and you've worked in educational publishing for more than 20 years, initially as a commissioning editor and later at various levels of management. You're transitioning over from the corporate world to the nonprofit world when you joined Book Dash 2 years ago. Very exciting to hear about that in a moment. And your specific areas of interest, among others, include children's literature, early literacy reading acquisition in multilingual contexts, and the role that literacy levels can play in combating inequality. So perfect, Dorette. So thank you for joining us today. And Nancy is the CEO of Child Aid. You have a doctorate in anthropology from Duke University. We've talked for a bit about your relationship with UCLA. You've worked as a social scientist for over 25 years, including at UCLA, Oregon Health and Science University. And you've done research in a variety of activities on the social implications of medicine and genetic technology. Fascinating. You also transitioned to the leadership role of Child Aid, an NGO that I didn't know until we had a chance to meet, that you actually helped found many years earlier, but then were able to move over to support it in a full-time capacity. So that's very exciting. and bringing your expertise in research, evaluation, and program development with a steep learning curve in running a business that we could certainly talk about as a newly minted nonprofit that we've rolled out from USAID. We probably have sort of stories and advice that we could swap with each other as well. So thanks, Nancy and Dorette, for joining us. Maybe elaborating just a little bit. I've just given a little bit of a background, but here you are now. And to hear a little bit more about the journey of took you where you are to where you are right now would be great. And then we'll go a little bit further into a formal conversation. But maybe Nancy, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit more about that path and some of the aha moments that have taken you where you are now.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to me that Dorette went from the corporate world to the nonprofit world, because I went from spending my life in the academic world to the nonprofit world, which I thought was going to be an easy transition. And as you repeated, I thought the skills that I was going to be bringing were mainly around really bringing rigor to our literacy program, which started in a fairly diffuse way with providing books. We happen to have some access to a lot of children's books, and we were working with local partners to start libraries. And then over a period of time, and my husband and I were both doing other things, but it became clear that libraries in Guatemala did not have enough of a pull factor to really be having an impact on education, and that the real problem was the lack of training of teachers and the lack of resources in schools. And so while I was still in academia, we were starting to put together a best practices curriculum, hired a director of education who had a master's degree. And I felt that we really had something that had great potential. At the same time, I kind of felt that I was banging my head against a wall in academia, both in terms of the constant need to apply to National Institutes of Health for grants, which I was successful, but it was exhausting. And also just, I had sort of said what I wanted to say. And so I auditioned to our board of directors for the CEO job. And as you alluded to, I discovered after about 6 months of working on getting together a quantitative evaluation and doing this and doing that I was actually running a business, which has been very, very exciting. But I went out and found a management coach and said, how do you read a budget? How do you do this? How do you think about actually managing people? It's been very exciting. In the, I guess, 8 years now that I've been in this position, we've tripled our size in terms of starting with no office, now having 3 offices in 3 different parts of Guatemala, having about 6 staff and now 30 staff. So I think we've learned a lot in the pandemic, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, which has actually been very validating as opposed to terrifying. And I feel that we are kind of at a just add money stage of being ready to grow.
Well, that's exciting that you hear the transition, but then the passion about being able to sort of grow it in time, and then having a base of products upon which, I get your point about just add money, that you can replicate or scale. So we'll love to hear more sort of those vehicles to which people could add money of some of your successful activities in just a moment. And Dorette, your own sort of transition, just in terms of where you are now. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, how you ended up where you are.
Thanks, Tony. And Nancy, it's so interesting to hear about your transition, about how you could draw so heavily on your previous skills to kind of make your new environment really work. So I started life as a high school teacher, and then got very interested in the systemic impact that good learning material could have in an educational context like ours, which is very unequal. So you have about 20% of really, really good schools and 80% schools that are under-resourced and struggling. So I moved, my first transition was from actual classroom teaching to educational publishing, because good educational materials can really fill a fantastic gap. And it's interesting that in my 14 years at Pearson, which is a big American and multinational organization, my interest moved down all the way from high school, lower down, lower down, lower down, lower down. And eventually, after I left the corporate world for various reasons, many of them personal, and I think just wanting a change, it became clear to me that the lower down in the system you can start to make an impact, the more impact you can have. So when I saw that Bookdash was recruiting, I was very excited because I know the founders of the organization. They all were people who worked in publishing before. And I found the concept incredibly innovative. I can say that because it's not my concept. I'm just helping to make it work and to grow it in the world. So for me, I think I finally arrived at, I don't think I can go any lower. We are focused on preschool 0 to 5. And in fact, we really encourage our organizations to think very young, to think 0 to 2. You know, the first 1,000 days initiatives to really make the most of that golden time when a child's brain development is at super speed. And the more you give and the more stimulation there is and the more input there is, the bigger the impact and the bigger the result really for that child and for the family and for society, actually. So it's interesting how I've, as I say, moved from high school to really preschool. But very interesting, I think what I love about Bookdash is the fact that our team consists of 3 people only. Julia, who's joined us on the call, and then we have a colleague who does all our administrative work. But we, in November, managed to have a fantastic virtual celebration of a big milestone for us, which is that we distributed our 1 millionth book. So, yeah, to children. So I think I love the fact that we are very small, but we have very wide reach because we are very clear about our remit and our place in the value chain. We provide resources that people don't have. And our vision is for children to own books. And in fact, our vision statement is that all children should own 100 books by the age of 5. And for those of us who work and live kind of middle-class lives, when you look at your children's bookshelves when they go to school, you'll easily find 100 books there. So it sounds like a lot, but the moment you actually quantify it, it's not a lot. And we know from research how book ownership can actually change a child's perception of themselves. They see themselves as book owners, they see themselves as readers, they have a scholarly orientation. Suddenly the family is a reading family. So I could go on for the whole of our 1 hour, but I'll stop there. But just to say that I think what's been really useful in my background is the fact that I do have management experience and I do have a lot of business experience, having worked in a big corporate like Pearson. And it helps us, I think, really think about Bookdash as a business. We're just a non-profit. So, you know, the more we can optimize our margins, the more books we can print, the more we, you know, so that's really exciting, is to be able to apply all those business principles, but for fantastic impact and really low down in our children's lives.
Yeah, that's terrific. Doretta, it reminds me that I first met Arthur Atwell, right? When I was at USAID in the education team. And when I relatively early on in starting Bookdash, like I was at USAID for 11 years, just recently left. And to hear that you guys are celebrating your millionth book is so incredibly exciting, and with the size of the team. And Nancy, just thinking about sort of the similar triggers of success upon which that in terms of child aid. So maybe let me just again ask sort of a general question getting to your institutions. Nancy, what have been platforms of success or indicators of success upon which that you've said, okay, now we could go to the next level? Can you think of any of those related to child aid that sort of the light bulb went off, or you had a particular donor that came in, or something that was sort of an indicator of the next level of moving on?
Yeah, I think that the point at which it started was when I realized that the different positions that we had in the team in Guatemala, there were people who were out really doing the teacher training, and then there was some supervisory positions, that really the way to set that up was in teams, so that we have a what we call an asesor, sort of supervisory person who has very few teachers they're working with, and then they have 4 to 6 people who report to them. And those teams could be a unit of replication, and within each office we have a top person, and then the question is, how many teams can fit. We opened a second office because my question in terms of scaling and replication is just, can we do this if it's not like everybody's in the same room and everybody knows everybody else? And our second office worked much better than I thought it would, with actually people enjoying having some independence in their own office. And right before the pandemic, we had opened our third office. And each of these could be, the 3 could be reached in like an hour and a half of driving in Guatemala, which is scary driving, but you could still have a lot of contact. And then the pandemic hit, and there was no face-to-face contact. And we started to have to lean really heavily on Zoom and things like, and WhatsApp, and it's been great. And so my takeaway from that has been, we can do this. If we can do this in 3 offices without people having daily contact, we can do this in more offices. And another thing that happened right before the pandemic was our US born and raised, our expat country director left. And after thinking about, well, how was I going to replace him? How was I going to replace him? I thought, this is completely stupid. We have a fantastic top staff person who's a Guatemalan indigenous woman right there. And she has been learning. And so I promoted her, and it was like taking the lid off, something with yeast. I mean, she's a remarkable person. I feel that it's a little hard to disentangle what's the pandemic, and what's that, but it feels like the level of creativity of the staff has just increased massively. And I think because it's their country and they see the need so clearly, that sounds stupid saying it, but the desire to grow and to scale and to bring what we're doing to other places is massive. There's no like, well, we should stay small. It's like, let's see how much of this we can do.
That's perfect, Nancy. And then just emphasizing in terms of local capacity and leadership, a team dynamic working together, expansion of the model. I guess we'll get to a moment, we'll get a little bit of the greater infrastructure, but ultimately it's the team that you're working with. I mean, that sounds great. So Dorette, maybe we'll weave this into giving us a little bit more of a background to the Book Dash activities, but by way of which of the same thing, tell us about a recent event maybe that you hosted in the context of describing Book Dash, just to give us a little bit of a flavor. And then Nancy will come back, and then so we can hear a little bit more about the macro level for Child Aid. But Dorette, is there a particular event or activity that could paint the picture of what Book Dash is?
Yeah, so perhaps I can talk about something we were forced to do because of COVID, but which we had actually been considering for a while. So the innovation that lies at the heart of Book Dash is that we need to make books a lot more affordable, children's books, so that more people can own them, and so that we can distribute hundreds of thousands of books for very little money. And in order to do that, in order to remove the cost barrier, Book Dash works with the power of creative volunteers. So we ask professional writers and illustrators and designers to come and join us at a Book Dash event, which is a very festive event with like 50 people in a room. It's a bit like a hackathon. So we start on a Saturday morning with nothing. And 12 hours later at 9 o'clock that evening, we have 10 new children's books that people collaborated on. Many of our creative volunteers say it's like the best day of their life, or of the year. I won't say of the life, but They find it incredibly meaningful and fulfilling. And of course, with COVID, it was impossible for us to have the same kind of event. So we had to think about how to move a festive event with good food and music and fun activities that's really inspiring and so energizing, how to move that to a virtual platform so that we can continue making new content, because that is what our job is we need to put more relevant, relatable, new African children's stories into the world. And so in April last year, we were under what we called level 5 lockdown regulations in South Africa. It was like complete lockdown. We were housebound, literally, the whole country. And we decided it's now or never. And we invited some of our creative alumni, and we said, let's start small. Instead of 10 books, we'll do 3, but we'll do it all virtually. People all sit in their own lounge, as we are doing now. But it was very early on in the pandemic, so it was quite a mind shift for people. But it was very successful, and we were worried about the fact that the fun element is so difficult to replicate virtually. You know, with virtual donuts and virtual coffee, you have to hope that people can find pleasure in the activity itself, and they did. The feedback that we got from engagements with our creatives who participated said that they still found it really meaningful and fulfilling and fun, and they still feel that they've given this gift to the world, which is an open license new children's book. So that was a very big innovation for us. We pivoted, and we then repeated our second bookmaking event of the year in October last year, and we doubled. We made 6 books. We learned a lot of lessons. We know that we need more facilitators for a virtual event than we need for a physical event. We need different things. You need fantastic tools, and you need to somehow get eyes on team dynamics, which is very difficult virtually, because people can simply switch off their camera and you don't know if that person's happy or very stressed or whatever. So we've had to find ways around all kinds of challenges of doing things virtually. But after our second event, we are very confident that we now have a viable alternative to make new content. Whereas in the past, we were completely reliant on this big fest, basically. And now, of course, one of the major advantages is that we can use creative volunteers who sit everywhere. In our October event, we had people sitting in 9 different countries. We had a designer sitting in Ghana. We had an illustrator sitting in Burkina Faso. We had people sitting in Ireland and in the US. So we even had one person in Australia. So she worked through the night and we worked through the day. So the possibilities are just fantastic. And I think for us, that was a really important pivot to see that we can still do what we need to do, but in a different way.
Tony, you're muted.
Sorry, there has to be some event that I just do for the team that I'm speaking and it's muted. I just want to let you know that was completely planned. So we've gotten it out of the way for anybody else, just to let you know. So Dorette, I was saying that's terrific to hear both in terms of your typical model, but then how you sort of adapted for the COVID. We'll come back in a moment to see when COVID's over, what might be some of those lessons learned that you still want to retain. But thanks for explaining also the model of the Book Dash event, and have some specific ideas that we could also share in a moment about an event or initiative we have called Math Power, and seeing how that might connect to some of the book production that you guys are working on. But Nancy, tell us a little bit about the child aid model, and if there's a particular story or vignette that you'd like to highlight, people always, that really captures the essence of what child aid is doing, that'd be great.
Okay. So I think, as I already said, we identified the issue that we think is at the bottom of the tremendous lack of literacy in Guatemala, as being lack of training and lack of resources, and like Dorette wanted to start in the work in the primary grades. So what we have is a multi-year teacher training program where we do, based on our curriculum that we have, which is very much aligned with the national curriculum of Guatemala, which is easy because that's based on Bloom and Morsano and the sort of, basic accepted practices. We do workshops in schools where we get buy-in from the school principal. So it's an in-service day. So our attendance of teachers is, virtually everyone. We do a all-day workshop. And then after each workshop, we do 3 in-class coaching sessions where students are present and our coaches are there to help teachers implement the curriculum, the things that they've learned in the workshops, which is very much staged from simplest to more complex content. Including starting with things like reading aloud to kids, which sounds so obvious, but is absolutely not done in Guatemala, and introduces the idea of interactivity because the resources in Guatemala are so small, and the training of teachers, which is only through high school, is so limited that it sort of reproduces very rote learning, very little interaction with students. So Read Aloud actually kind of breaks that paradigm by showing teachers what it's like to read a book to children and have them interact. And from there, we move on to more complicated things like small groups and getting kids to write and classroom management, which is an enormous problem. So we have the workshops and then the follow-up coaching. We also buy and deliver grade appropriate Spanish language fiction and nonfiction books, leaving a school with 7 books per student, and helping set up both libraries in the school and lending programs. A thing that's really important in sort of thinking through or working through the nuance of this in terms of COVID is the level to which having those coaches that work with the school become trusted allies in the school, and the things that can't be replicated virtually. At the same time that we've discovered a lot more can be done virtually, like Dorette, than we thought could, coming up with that balance of things that, you can't establish that kind of trust without actually being there physically and over a period of time. The other thing that I think is really important to child aid is the communities that we're dealing with are dealing with being indigenous, and there's still tremendous racism in Guatemala against indigenous people. Rural indigenous women especially have the lowest rates of education, the highest rates of poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our coaches speak whatever language it is in the communities that we work in, as well as Spanish. And still most of them desire to and do wear traditional dress. So when they walk into a school as an authority figure, they are walking in and looking like the kids that they're teaching, but they are highly professional, and we've also managed to be able to pay salaries that are meaningful enough that our staff has kind of moved into the middle class in the communities that they're in. So I don't know if I can think of a particular vignette, but there's just a general feeling of appreciation among teachers, a feeling of owning the organization and being proud of working there among staff, and quantitative studies that we're doing showing that we actually are improving both teacher performance and student performance. So you're muted again. You're still muted.
Yeah, whatever. So, okay, I did that for another member of the team. So I get one more, so then there's 3 of us. So Nancy, I was going to say that's great. Nancy, first of all, there's a question from Judy, but before we get to that, Judy wanted to know what languages both projects use for books and instruction. Actually, just get to that right now. And hopefully later on, in just a few minutes, Judy, it'd be great for you to let folks know about the great work of African Story book as well. but maybe in immediate response, what are the languages, Nancy and Dorette, that you guys produce your books in?
So we're not producing books, so I'd love to talk to Dorette about that more. We have a list of books that are curated, and most of our books come from Scholastic, but we also buy from Guatemalan publishers as much as we can, which is really Mexican publishers. There's no real book publishing industry in Guatemala. Our books are all in Spanish, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that various studies, including one by USAID, made it quite clear that parents, even rural indigenous parents who are not terribly fluent in Spanish, want their kids to learn Spanish. That's one of the reasons they send them to school, because they realize that to have more options than being coffee pickers, they're going to need to be able to speak Spanish. The other thing, aside from the fact that books in those languages don't exist, is we find even with our staff who are fluent in the language that they grew up speaking, most of them can't read it or write it. They are much more oral languages, and we haven't completely figured out what to do about that. But at this point, we use bilingual bridging techniques where we start out working in first grade with a lot of the teaching going on in the indigenous language, and then moving away from that. So say talking about what is a story that's going to be read in Cachiquel, which is one of the languages, then reading it in Spanish, but helping kids understand words that they don't get because they're in Spanish, and then doing some follow-up in Cachiquel. So there are 23 indigenous languages in Guatemala, but they're not like mixed around. They're languages that developed in this mountainous terrain. And so basically a set of communities are probably speaking the same language. And when we moved to our third office in Totonicapan, which is one of the states in Guatemala, we hired staff from Totonicapan because they spoke Quiche, which is the language that's spoken there. So at this point, it's 3 languages that we're working in, but we would continue to expand if we needed to.
Okay, great. Nancy, thanks. Dorette, what about the teams that you assemble? I mean, you just talked about doing sort of 3 or 6 books, but in terms of language adaptations of it or language versioning, how do you guys work with, do you work with different languages?
Yes, we do. So mostly our books are created on a book dash day in English because it's the lingua franca of everyone who's working together. But when we have a writer who is able to write in another South African language, we've got 11 official languages. So those are languages that are, our language policy stipulates that children must learn in their mother tongue up to grade 3, up to the 3rd grade. So, and then after that, they transition to English as language of instruction, which does cause many problems. But the first 3 years and pre-primary is in the home language, the mother tongue. So when we have a writer who is able to also write their story in another South African official language, we ask them to do that on the day, which means that we have more than one version of the same story happening on the day. And then after we've produced the book and published it on our website, so we're a digital first publisher really, we then get the books translated with grant funding into the other 11 languages. So we have 146 original stories, if you count the English books, and that has been translated into a library of more than 500 titles, covering the various languages. So not every book is available in all 11 languages. It's a little bit also about the demand, about certain stories are just resonate more with a certain language community or whatever. So we feel very strongly about the fact that communities must have many books in the language that is widely spoken in the community, because our books go into the homes. So it's meant for an adult to read with a preschool child, or for children who have started learning to read independently, to read for pleasure. So it's very important that the books are available in the language that is widely spoken in the community. So that is how we work with languages. But the other fantastic thing about our books, because they're published under an open license on our website, and it's the most open of open licenses. There are no restrictions. We find that people from all over the world translate our books. So anyone can download our books, translate them, animate them, adapt them, condense them, put them together in compilations, sell them. They can do whatever they want with the content. And we get so many messages from people around the world saying, you know, we speak a very small dialect of whatever, Urdu, and our children don't have books in the language, but we have translated 10 of your Book Dash books into our little dialect, and now our children have some books. So there are fantastic stories about that. And Nancy, you are more than welcome to do exactly the same with our books. You know, select the ones that you feel might resonate with the communities that you work in. And we do get feedback from many people, you know, from people in South America, people in India, people in the US, people in other parts of Africa, saying that it's so fantastic for them to see a diverse community or a diverse society that's represented, that their children recognize themselves in the pages. So there's an identification that's possible. So I'm sure if you just go through all our 146 stories, you might be able to find something that could work and that you could then translate into the various languages.
I just sent you a private message asking for us to have a chance maybe to talk later.
That sounds great. It looks like there's another question from Bethany, and this is for Durrett. Can you see it, Durrett? I'm such a big fan of Book Dash's books and really want to thank for helping to provide high quality open source books. I'm curious what kind of incentives you offer to Book Dash participants. And if you could give I know you could read it as well as I, if you could get a general idea of how much money it takes to create one ebook. And then Nancy, in a moment, I want to come back to you and just talk about, I know you talked about your relationship with the ministry or the government. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that as an important sort of model for sustainability and scalability. But Durrett, let's at least take the first question with from Bethany.
So Bethany, it's an interesting question, and we get asked that question quite often, but we offer zero incentive to the creative volunteers who participate. They apply because they are passionate about what we do, and they all say that it's fantastic for them to be able to give back by using their professional skills. Because sometimes when people volunteer, they volunteer doing something quite low level, which doesn't draw on their specific expertise, where, you know, they work in a soup kitchen or they build a house or something, you know, Habitat for Humanity kind of project. But here we ask them to use their professional skills, but to use it for the kind of greater good. And it just sits so well with people. They love it. We have repeat Book Dashers. We've got some people who apply every single time that we have an event. They want to come and spend the day with us, or they spend it in their own lounge, but working on a book for us. So they have no monetary incentive, nothing. What they do get out of the day is obviously fulfillment and meaning and what people get when they volunteer. And secondly, it does enhance their kind of resumes to be able to say that they've published a children's book. You know, they've illustrated a children's book, and here it is, it's published. It's a difficult kind of circuit to get into. If your dream is to be a children's book illustrator, it helps a lot if you can say, look, I've illustrated these 3 books for Book Dash. It just a kind of, you know, boosts. So people do it for those kind of reasons as well, but sure, really they just do it because they love doing it, and they love the idea of Book Dash, and they love the idea that their gift to the world ends up in the hands of hundreds of thousands of children. It's that idea of the you know, the pebble in the pond and the ripples just going very far. So and then your question about the money, this is now, you'll have to help me convert it to dollars, but it costs us about 120,000 Rand to run a physical event. So if you divide that by 20, more or less, is that $6,000? I think so.
8,000.
Okay, thank you. Clearly, I was never a maths person.
No. So 120,000 Rand equals 8,000. I haven't divided it. So
okay, so it's about $8,000, which then would cover the cost of all the content creation. And a physical event is more expensive, obviously, because you feed the people, you pay a venue cost, you there are lots of costs. Our virtual events are a lot cheaper, but for both the events that we did virtually, we had already secured funding for a physical event. So what we could do with the balance of the funding that we received was to then pay for the translations, which isn't usually covered by the costs of the event. Plus, we printed the books, and that our funders were very happy about that. They felt it was a really good use of their funding. And our translations cost us in the region of 5,000 Rand to get the translation done, and the page design and the layout and whatever. So divide by 20, more or less.
That's $335 for 5,000 Rand for. So, well, thanks for the question, Bethany. And then Dorette, I think you're right. I know from all my years for supporting the All Children Reading Grand Challenge and being engaged with, initiatives like Judy's with Africa Storybook, or Story Weaver, or the Global Digital Library. In many cases, it simply was a joy of sharing creative inputs or thoughts with a wider audience. Of course, there is the element that ultimately there are costs of, like you mentioned, Dorette, like translation is costs, hosting an event are cost as well. So I want to come back in a moment about who have been the major supporters or maybe repeat supporters, but let's start with the role of government. So Nancy, when I was at USAID, clearly it was important to have government buy-in for activities that were taking place in schools. Now, there was obviously sets of activities that were taking place outside of schools, but one of the forms of sustainability and scale was having government engagement. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the government, the Ministry of Education in Guatemala, as a factor in your program?
And I'm not allowed to curse, right? So it definitely has made a big difference that we have formal certification from the government of Guatemala to offer our program. We're actually right now in the process of renewal. It's like an every 5-year thing. There aren't a lot of NGOs who have this, and it means that we can talk to any departmental director or district supervisor who are Ministry of Education employees and offer our program. We also get pulled into meetings. There's also someone who's chief of party for USAID for several years who has been an advocate of ours. And if funding ever starts actually flowing again, we may be an implementing partner, a piece of one of their grants. But the Ministry of Education is most of the things that they do, they're doing on other people's money. USAID has been really important in getting the national curriculum created. USAID will not give money. I don't understand exactly how this works, but they won't give money for program implementation in the education sphere, although that will in the health sphere. So what you get is a lot of 400-page documents that don't make it down to a very usable level with teachers. On a webinar with the Ministry of Education open to all teachers just recently, they made the statement that because of the virtual materials they had produced, all kids in the country had lost no learning during this past year, which is just insane. And so everybody was being promoted to the next grade. So you're going to have kids in second grade who haven't learned to decode, and they're being expected to do second grade things. So and the digital divide is, is humongous. And so we have been very successful in doing our workshops online, helping teachers make more usable some of the paper things that are sent from the Ministry of Education, being able to divide teachers by grade level, not just schools, because we're doing it virtually. We think we've actually figured out a way to shave a year off our program while adding more content. So that's all been terrific. But the absolute wall that we hit is what about the students, right? And in a survey that we did, there are maybe 10 or 15% of the families that we're involved with who have internet enabled anything in their houses. Yep. And that is the the money involved in that is so enormous that there's just no way we can touch it. We have helped teachers, all of whom have smartphones but don't necessarily have adequate data plans. We've actually found a way to buy data for them so that they can join our workshops virtually, and that's going to cost us maybe $15,000-$20,000. That's affordable. But what do you do about all these kids who don't have access to internet? And it's heartbreaking. And I don't, have an answer. That's a Bill Gates level issue, kind of. And the government of Guatemala, I'm sorry, I'll shut up in a minute. I'm getting up. The government of Guatemala won't acknowledge the problem, so they're not even looking for a solution.
Yeah. Well, Nancy, it's a legitimate, because it's both a term of power engagement when you have that validation and the ability to be able to sort of get into more schools and to access additional resources. But you're right, it also could be an impediment or obstacle if you don't have that relationship. It sounds like you do, but also if priorities are focused elsewhere. And as a Ministry of Education official, you have enormous priorities, but as an implementing partner or somebody deeply engaged in the classroom, what the needs are, it's a balancing act, I imagine, in terms of where in the infrastructure is the government providing support, but what are the needs that you're seeing from the clients that you're serving as well. So it's a good point, and I appreciate your sort of raising that it's two-edged. Dorette, what about what have been, let's talk about that in the same context. What's a major sort of collaborator or maybe repeat supporter of your project? But then what is an example of a stumbling block that if you could just get over that hurdle, and we'll put aside just add money that Dorette had said, because we clearly recognize how important it is for successful projects such as yours. But is there something that you've thought of, like, it's something that's missing for the ecosystem? Let's maybe just a short answer to that, and then I'd like to invite maybe any sort of additional comments from folks as we close up. But Dorette, what about sort of that partnership angle?
So we are incredibly lucky to have built up a team of funding partners who really appreciate what we do, see the impact, and are repeat offenders in that they keep on funding us, and we are incredibly happy about that. We get no money from government at all. So all our funding partners are, they tend to be private philanthropies or the kind of corporate social investment arms of large financial institutions in South Africa, insurance companies or banks. They have a statutory obligation to spend a percentage of their income on corporate social investment. So we spend a lot of time building relationships. We spend a lot of time reporting to our funders in a way that shows them what their money has done and the impact that it has had. And we're very lucky that we have a relatively diverse base, so we're not too dependent on one big funder, because that's also problematic. But we've got a set of very kind of trustworthy funding organizations that we've got a very open relationship with, and that they we take each other into our confidence as saying, this is what we want to achieve this year. Can you walk with us? Can you be on this journey with us? And often they'll say yes, because they love what we do and they love the fact that their money enables that. So the one thing that government has done in South Africa, and I think it's not a small thing, is that they are trying to address the fact of digital access. Exactly what you said, Nancy. People might have smartphones, but the data costs are really prohibitive, so people can't access good content. And so what our courts have done is they've actually, there was a court order that was handed down in December 2019 already, that our big mobile data providers have to bring their costs down. And then the second thing, and this was a campaign that was spearheaded by civil society, but government supported it, and it's now happened, is that there's been a 0 rating on websites with educational content. And Bookdash is part of that, which means that our books have always been free to read online, but now when you visit our website and you read any of our stories, you also don't use any of your data. Wow. So yes, So there's a big, I think it's a very, very useful campaign for civil society in any developing country to embark on, is to say, you know, these companies make so much money, the mobile data providers already, that they can really, they won't even feel it if they zero rate all the websites with educational content. So it's an idea, Nancy, that you might want to, you know, take up somewhere. And we've seen a massive increase in visitors to our website since our site was zero rated. And it's clearly people who are new visitors to our site and who read our stories in African languages and not just in English. So
Great.
that's been, that's been very, sorry, that was not a short answer.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Well, I was just going to say, maybe folks can turn on their screen right now, because just as we sort of wrap up, Dorette and Nancy, of course, we have the privilege of having sort of an hour-long dialogue, but there's so many more questions and so many more experiences that you could share. So among which is that we take this, but what we would really like is if we can get maybe little vignettes from you, we'd be happy to feature in our next e-news. Let's say in every 2 weeks, we're putting out an e-news. We have a variety of other publications that we're using. Maybe to plant the seed for you guys and with the audiences, we have an initiative that are running called Math Power. And we're looking for ideas of ways that we could showcase, basically, for example, books or creating books on math themes. I imagine that you may have some ideas of that, or introducing the joy of math through programs that you guys are supporting. So happy to have folks follow up with that. But want to thank our audience, first of all. Happy faces we could see from some of the folks. And Khalid, I also noted your question in the chat box as well, that it works on multiple intelligences, using music and all sorts of other forms of capturing young people's imaginations about literacy. So I want to thank you for your work in that regard. Judy, the great work that Africa Storybook is doing. Nicole, I think you had a closeout announcement that you wanted to mention, but maybe let's do a quick round of applause for Dorette and Nancy for their contributions. And then Nicole, over to you.
Yeah, of course. Let me just share my screen real quick. Can everyone see that?
Oh, that's funny.
So I figured we just give this chance to wish Tony a happy birthday, and just end it with a celebration.
Well, thank you, Nicole.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
We have an birthday cake. If we could just roll that out, everyone gets a big slice.
That's really kind. Thanks, Nicole.
Of
Well, I want
course.
to thank everybody for our birthday celebration. For Nancy and Dorette, for the great work that your organizations have done. Please let us know how we can help share that. Judy, you've been a big advocate of this. The Mobiles for Education Alliance, at one level, is a convening platform of multilateral, bilateral development and donor agencies that have common interest in the use of ed tech in low resource context. But to your point, Dorette, that you've made, and Nancy as well, our approach is not starting with the technology, it's starting with the content and the teachers and the students and the classrooms and the professionals. So a variety of our activities, it's interesting. My role is always the speed bump for technology enthusiasts that just wanted to put a device in every school. Even places where you have that as a good fortune, that doesn't necessarily mean that less learning is taking place or literacy is taking place. So just to let you know, we're allies in this. If there's anything we could do to spread the good works of your organizations, whether it's a tech or non-tech intervention, our community of 34 bilateral development institutions and products that we have, our EdTech Connected e-zine, our e-news that goes out every 2 weeks. We're setting up a media channel. So we might come back and ask for short 7-minute video clips from Dorette, you and Nancy, that we can include as part of our media channel that we're developing as well. But if you don't already subscribe, folks, to the e-news, it's on our website. You can drop the link to it. And look forward to seeing you at future eCafe events as well. So thanks for joining us today.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
It's been very enjoyable.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone.